I'm Mark Golub, and as all political eyes are now turned toward the Granite State's Tuesday primaries in New Hampshire, here's where things seem to stand. Going into the weekend, the Wall Street Journal Marist poll shows Donald Trump has dropped 8% since the Iowa caucuses, from 38 to 30%, and now leads the Republican field by only 13 points. Senator Marco Rubio, whose strong third place showing in Iowa has cast him as the rising Republican star, has climbed over Senator Ted Cruz into second place, gaining 5 points to 17%. Senator Ted Cruz is up 1 point at 15%, though he now trails Marco Rubio by 2 percentage points in third place. Governor John Kasich is up 3% and has moved ahead of Jeb Bush into fourth place with 10%. Jeb Bush is now in fifth place, holding at 9%. And Governor Chris Christie, down 2%, and Dr. Ben Carson, up 1%, are both at 4%. So as you can see, there's some real fluidity to the New Hampshire primaries, and many feel Donald Trump is no longer a surefire winner in New Hampshire. While on the Democrat side, Senator Bernie Sanders continues to hold a 20-point lead over Hillary Clinton in their New Hampshire primary, and that seems to be holding pretty steady. Well, for some analysis and insight on where election 2016 stands now, I'm most pleased to have on our JBS phones from Virginia, Dr. Martin Cohen, Associate Professor of Political Science at James Madison University. And Marty Cohen is the co-author of a political book that's received a great deal of attention this election cycle, entitled The Party Decides: Presidential Nominations Before and After Reform, which documents in part how party superdelegates can influence the outcome of primary elections so that the American public actually has little or no say in who becomes the party nominee for president. And Marty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Marty, tell us a little bit about yourself first. You're a Philadelphia boy, yes?
That's right. I was born and raised in Philadelphia and went to college at Penn State and got my PhD at UCLA.
As a young person, how active were you, or how active are you now Jewishly?
Well, we belong to a synagogue here in Charlottesville, Congregation Beth Israel, and our two kids are involved in the preschool there, and my wife and I are very involved in synagogue activities, fundraising and things like that.
Lovely. So, Marty, I see that in addition to political science, you teach a course at James Madison University on religion and politics. Is that correct?
That's right.
And what do you try to do in that class?
Well, try to, in the American context, make connections between people's religious beliefs and their political beliefs. And the basis is a text from James Hunter called Culture Wars, which basically argues that each religious tradition is divided into two sort of wings, the sort of liberal progressive wing and a more conservative orthodox wing. And the differences between traditions is less important than the differences within tradition.
Interesting. By the way, speak to me for one moment about how that impacts what you see, especially in the Republican primaries. Because, Marty, I am struck by the amount of Christian reverence the candidates seem to have for their Christianity. And time again, whether it's Marco Rubio, whether it's Ted Cruz, and then others seem to, Ben Carson, and almost every one of the candidates seems to be indicating that their Christian faith is at the center of their political lives. And it's interesting, Jews love secularists. Even if Jews are very involved themselves in Judaism and Jewish life, we have done very well in America as a result of the separation of church and state. So I'm curious to hear your reaction in general to, again, this Christian affiliation that we keep hearing from Republican candidates, and how you think that plays in the Jewish community.
Well, I think that, for about 35 years, since Ronald Reagan first ran in 1980, Republican presidential candidates have felt the need to appeal to their evangelical base. And with the influx of evangelicals back into the political process in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they've been a staple of the Republican base, a large faction within the party, and it's necessary to gain a large majority of their votes if you want to get the nomination for the Republican Party. And to win a general election, you need to bring them out to the polls in November. So there's definitely an electoral calculation that's being made here. And as far as the effect on the Jewish community, certainly there is a sort of a repelling effect when it comes to the mixture of church and state amongst most Jews, as you rightly point out. And while Republicans feel that they can make inroads among the Jewish community over issues like Israel, I don't see that happening as much because of the overt marriage of Christian fundamentalism and Republican Party politics.
Fascinating. By the way, in terms of your own analysis, do you have a political bias of your own which we should be aware of? Do you lean strong Democrat or Republican yourself?
Well, personally, I'm extremely liberal and have voted Democratic in every election that I've been eligible to vote. But as far as bias is concerned, there is none in my research and in my teaching. I teach a class not only on religion and politics, but on the Christian right and Republican politics, and so it's been a lot of my research has been into evangelical Christianity, which couldn't be more opposite of what I believe personally. But in the process of my research, I've interviewed many Christian fundamentalist activists and politicians, and gotten along very well with them on a personal level, realizing that they just have different beliefs and different views as to how politics should work.
Okay, so as an academic, an academician, you don't feel that your strong personal feelings for the liberal position and the Democratic Party get in your way of analyzing what's going on in general within the primary process and later on during the actual national election?
No. My co-authors and I are concerned with documenting what has happened and attempting to forecast what is going to happen. And really, there's no place for our own views or beliefs in that process. It's strictly a social scientific endeavor with whether we're gathering quantitative or qualitative data and using that to test hypotheses. All of that is, the scientific method, and it doesn't really matter what we think or what we believe in terms of especially who we're rooting for, let's say.
Okay. So, Marty, were there any surprises for you that came out of the Iowa caucus process?
Well, I think that the big surprise was that Marco Rubio was able to finally, I think, realize some of his potential. The over-under for him was sort of 15% going in, and he achieved that and broke through that barrier very easily and almost finished in second place. And we've been sort of expecting this from Marco Rubio for several months. We've sort of, from our book's perspective, look at him as sort of the perfect candidate for the Republicans in terms of his ability to unite the party, to appeal to a variety of factions within the party, and to have the best chance, we believe, of winning a general election for the Republicans. So we were a bit surprised that he hadn't jumped ahead in some of the other indicators like endorsements and polls earlier than now.
Okay. I want to talk to you for a moment about Jewish issues related to this primary season.
Sure.
We hear all the time that if Hillary Clinton is nominated and wins in November, she will be the first woman president. And of course, a huge deal was made out of the fact that Barack Obama was the first African-American president. How do you explain the fact that we never hear reference to Bernie Sanders being Jewish, and should he be nominated and or elected, he would be the first Jewish president?
I think that would become an issue, and we would be talking about it were he to win the nomination. I think he's still such a long shot at this point that to defeat Hillary Clinton, that we're not thinking of it as a realistic opportunity. Certainly, Americans have come a long way in their tolerance towards various groups, minority groups, in terms of their willingness to vote for them in elections. Whether it be a woman, an African American, a gay president, an atheist. We've come a long way, but there are certainly some people who still have reservations about voting for certain so-called minority groups.
It in some way is a good sign for the Jews, is it not, Marty?
I think so. I think, were this, the 1920s and Al Smith was running as a Catholic candidate, he received horrible bigotry,
yes.
And many people voted against him simply because he was Catholic. And then a generation later, John F. Kennedy was able to win the nomination and the presidency with a significant amount of Protestant votes. So I think we've come a long way, and I think, if Bernie were to get the nomination, I do think that issue would be raised, but it would be raised, I would hope, in a way that was aspirational and positive and not negative at all.
Okay. Incidentally, to the best of my knowledge and memory, Senator Joe Lieberman was the first Jew to be on a national ticket, albeit as vice president. Is that correct?
Yes, right.
At that time, his Jewishness was a factor.
I
In other words,
think so.
People did mention it.
He was definitely, a more moderate Democrat, and as his future, trajectory suggests, as he moved to become an independent and defeat the Democratic candidate in his own primary race, he definitely was more hawkish and conservative than most American Jews. So in a way, he didn't fit the paradigm of normal Jewish politicians. But Bernie Sanders obviously is as liberal as we can find in American politics today, and that sort of squares more with his religiosity.
Yes. Although, Marty, I don't know that he is an active or observant Jew. I think it has more to do simply with his family background, but he is Jewish.
Yes.
Okay. The other glaring absence in this primary cycle has to do with the State of Israel. In the past, Marty, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the U.S.-Israeli relationship have been major themes in primary elections. This year, hardly a word. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure about that. I think there are plenty of issues that are on the table in both parties that have maybe eclipsed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now. I think there's not a lot of disagreement certainly among the Republicans, I think, on the issue of Israel. I think they're all going to be extremely staunch supporters of the State of Israel, and I think that the favorite on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton, would also prove to be a very, very good friend and an ally to Israel. So I don't think there's a lot of room for disagreement there. In a general election, maybe the Republicans would try to make it an issue, depending on who they nominate. But I see, both parties sort of being very friendly and supportive of Israel, and therefore maybe there's not any sort of daylight there to exploit or explore.
Okay, and I understand, Marty, that you're looking at the election in a more global way, so this may be an unfair question for me to ask you. But for example, Bernie Sanders is an uber liberal, and very many people in the far left camp have been very critical of Israel, especially as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you know anything about where Bernie Sanders stands on support for the State of Israel?
I don't, and I wouldn't want to speculate based on, his other positions that put him in that liberal camp. I don't know offhand, his history in terms of his voting history and his speech making on the subject. And you're right to point out that it has not been sort of on the campaign radar. And I'm not sure maybe something would have to happen globally that would bring it back into the spotlight. But I wouldn't want to speculate on his particular positions on Israel. I do think, most, if not all, national politicians in America today, have been very good friends to Israel, and I think they will continue to be. There is criticism, certainly, but overall, I think the differences, let's say, between the parties is very slim, when you look at it from perspective.
Well, that's interesting. Jews tend to have two primary concerns. They tend to be very liberal. We tend to be committed to certain social values. And many American Jews believe the Democrat Party is more sympathetic to the values which are at the core of the Jewish tradition's social concern, and they vote 70% Democrat.
Right.
At the same time, there are many Jews for whom the state of Israel's well-being and survival is paramount at this particular point in history, and they care about the extent to which an administration is going to be supportive of Israel, and more important, is not going to push Israel in directions that might be threatening to Israel's safety and security vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And the popular notion is that Republicans are stronger when it comes to support for the state of Israel. And so there are Jews who are leaning Republican for that reason. As you look at the Jewish community, do you feel that the overall perspective remains the same? And so, for example, would you expect, again, 70% of the Jewish community to go for the Democratic nominee?
I think you laid it out pretty well, and I think that, I think a majority of Jews will still go with the Democratic Party for those reasons you mentioned. I do think there's a possibility that you might see a little bit of an uptick for the Republicans. And to bring it back to the earlier questions you asked me, a lot of that is the evangelical influence on the Republican Party.
Yes.
Evangelical Christians have been very, very supportive of the state of Israel mostly for their own theological reasons, but that has brought that to the forefront of the Republican Party. And if you go back to George Bush Sr.'s presidency and even Ronald Reagan, it was pretty clear that the Democrats were the better friend to Israel at that time. So things have changed, and Republicans have tried to make inroads into the American Jewish vote, and I could see, them with an extra 5 to 8 points, let's say, from the Jewish community this cycle because of that.
Yes. I think that the Republican Party has articulated concerns that are at the heart of Jewish consciousness when it comes to Israel in a way that is very appealing to many American Jews, again, for whom Israel is of paramount concern. You and I cannot predict what's going to happen. This has been a strange year. But if someone were to ask me, I would say it is very unlikely that Bernie Sanders is going to be able to win enough delegates throughout the country to win the nomination away from Hillary Clinton. Again, without asking you to promise us an answer, do you see it in a similar way?
Yes, I feel that even with Bernie Sanders' victory in New Hampshire, which is seemingly likely,
yes,
and even if he had come out on top in Iowa, which was essentially a tie, we believe in our book that Hillary Clinton's establishment party support is going to be more than enough to carry her to victory. She's got a broad range of support across the party. It's very broad, it's very deep, and it's just very difficult for candidates without that establishment support to succeed in the nominating process. And so it may be a long slog. It may be, it may go, 3 or 4 months, but slowly but surely Hillary Clinton's going to amass the delegates to win the nomination. That's my prediction. It's been our prediction for months now. And, frankly, in the past, a win in Iowa and a win in New Hampshire could vault a candidate, to the nomination. But we don't think things work that way anymore. We think that it's the fundamentals, the establishment support in the form of elite endorsements that really, determine these nominations.
Okay, and what about on the Republican side? Many people never expected Donald Trump ever to be the leader in the Republican field. There are some who feel now that he is waning. But what do you predict? Whom do you think in the end is most likely to gain the Republican nomination?
Well, I think the Republicans will eventually get it right. And by get it right, I mean they'll pick the person who best satisfies their policy goals and gives them the best chance to win in November. And to me, that's clearly Marco Rubio. He seems to be, of the quote-unquote establishment candidates, the most capable, the most polished, and the best able to unite the party factions. I think it will be, if Trump wins New Hampshire and Rubio finishes well ahead of the other establishment candidates like Kasich and Bush and Christie, that it will soon be a three-person race, and between Cruz and Rubio and Trump. And in that three-person race, I like Rubio as the one who's able to consolidate the establishment support and ride that to victory.
Okay. I want to come now to your book. Okay. You seem to be saying that in some way, again, you refer to superdelegates, and in some way, Marty, there's a suggestion that the primaries at some level are a bit of a charade, and that the party machine with their superdelegates will ultimately determine the candidates that run for president of the United States. Would you speak to that for one moment? To what extent is the American people making the choice? To what extent is so much going on behind the scenes that, again, I use the word, it's all a charade, and many people, Marty, are so angry at the political process because they believe it's a rigged and fixed game. What can you tell us?
Well, I would say that we do talk about superdelegates, but that's not the main thrust of the book. The main thrust of the book is essentially that during the invisible primary, the year or so before the voters get a chance to vote, that party elites sort of coordinate and try to coordinate on one candidate that they believe best represents the party's ideals and gives them the best chance to win in November with a united front. And they used to have the convention that they could do this in, right? The convention was what determined the nominees up until the late 1960s, and that was purely a backroom, elite-driven process. Primaries were just sort of beauty contests and a chance for the party elites to see how the candidates did in the voting, but it was not binding at all. When the Democrats changed their rules in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it changed the game, and it gave voters a lot of power. And we argue that the party has been trying to gain back that power by coordinating early on a candidate and providing them with the resources necessary to win the nomination. Now, we rely on endorsements, public endorsements, as a measure of elite support, and we find that for the most part, in almost every contested nomination since 1980, the candidate with the most endorsements pre-Iowa has become the nominee.
Very interesting.
So that, we argue, is for an elite-driven process, one in which the voters, it's not necessarily a charade, the voters could, upend the process, and we've seen, voters and candidates this cycle really, make things messy in terms of what the party might want. So I think charade is a little bit strong of a word, but the party is trying to decide ahead of time and get who they want in terms of a nominee.
Okay. It's interesting the way you say it. On the one hand, you say charade is too strong a word. On the other hand, you describe a process where the party elite has already decided on one or two people, and they may want to see how one or the other plays out, but that there is a sense, you feel, of the party, the professional politicians within a party, really knowing whom they want to nominate as their candidate for president. So to that extent, a lot of this is, if it's not a charade, Marty, it still is less significant than the media and the public tends to believe.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think, part of, the publicity that our book's been getting has sort of, opened up people's eyes to what has gone on and what may continue to go on. And I think the media is more aware of what's going on in the so-called invisible primary. It was always called the invisible primary because it was behind the scenes. No one was paying attention.
Yes.
Now we pay plenty of attention in the year before Iowa. So, it's actually made it more difficult for the parties to operate behind the scenes because there's been more media coverage. So if you're a fan of, direct democracy and, voters having 100% say, you might not, appreciate or like the conclusions that we make in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sort of agnostic about, whether this is good for democracy or not. We talk about, the quality of candidates that are picked by the party versus the quality of candidates that have been picked by the voters, in years where the party hasn't gotten its act together. And, you can argue one way or the other which are the better candidates. But basically, you're right. The political professionals, this is what they do. This is their job.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they seek to get something out of politics more than the everyday voter. And so it's in their interest to try to do what they can to get who they want.
Marty, we have a lovely picture of you up on the screen. You look like a lovely guy. You and I have had some contact on the phone. You are a lovely, lovely man. But
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I can't tell how old you are or how many election cycles you've actually lived through. Can you give us a sense of, where...
Well, I'm 42.
Yeah.
And 1992 was the first election that I voted in for Bill Clinton.
Okay.
And what sparked my interest in nomination politics was going up to New Hampshire the day before the 1992 New Hampshire primary and basically just immersing myself and our class, immersing ourselves in the pageantry and the holding of the signs and the going to the rallies and the surveying of the people. And it really got me interested in nomination politics. And when I got to graduate school, I did a paper on New Hampshire and Iowa, and then that led us into this book project that has become, fairly successful.
Absolutely, and I recommend it to everyone. And I've heard you in other contexts, and I really wanted you so much for JBS, and I'm very pleased to meet you now formally through this program. I hope, Marty, you'll let me call you perhaps after New Hampshire, and as this process goes on, you'll tell me if you're changing your mind in any way, and you'll also point out to us things we should be watching for. I hope you let me call you again.
Anytime, no problem.
All right,
great,
you be well. Marvelous work, Marty. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Martin Cohen, Associate Professor of Political Science at James Madison University and the co-author of The Party Decides, Presidential Nominations Before and After Reform. And he brings some very interesting perspective on how the process works. And you heard him say, I guess he expects Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders to win New Hampshire, and he also does not feel that either of those wins would be determinative in determining the candidates who ultimately are nominated by the Democrat and Republican parties. We will talk to him again, and we'll watch the process, especially as it relates at any point to issues of specific Jewish concern. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and the producers of this edition of Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.